Sometimes the most unlikely hero stands up when everyone else sits down. There's something powerful about watching a man fight for his friend when the whole world has turned against them both. In the courtroom of Coyote Ridge, they all laughed when Eli Boone walked in. This mountain man looked rough and wild, nothing like the fancy lawyers in their pressed suits. His friend Jed sat facing charges that would take away his ranch and his freedom. Everyone expected Eli to say something foolish. But when the moment came, Eli stood up and said something that changed everything. What did this simple mountain man know that nobody else did? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered wooden sign at the edge of town read, Coyote Ridge, population 847, though most folks figured that number had been generous, even when it was painted 15 years back. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street, where dust devils danced between the general store and Murphy's Saloon. This was cattle country, where a man's word still meant something, and handshake deals sealed more business than any fancy contract ever could. Jedediah Toller had been part of this landscape for 37 years, arriving as a young man with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn streak wide as the Montana sky. His ranch, the Circle T, sprawled across 1,200 acres of good grazing land, bordered by Willow Creek on the east and the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains on the west. The ranch house sat like a weathered sentinel, its wraparound porch bearing witness to decades of coffee mornings and evening. Reflections, Jed was the kind of man who still tipped his hat to ladies and called everyone sir or ma'am, regardless of their station. His wife Sarah had passed 5 years back, leaving him to tend the land with the help of 2 hired hands and memories that seemed to echo in every creak of the old floorboards. At 63, his shoulders carried the weight of honest labor, and his weathered face told stories of harsh winters and drought summers survived through sheer determination. The Circle T wasn't the biggest spread in the county, but it was honest land worked by honest methods. Jed's cattle bore his brand with pride, and his fences stood straight and true, marking boundaries that neighboring ranchers respected without question. He'd never been one for fancy equipment or newfangled methods, just good horses, reliable dogs, and the wisdom passed down from his father and grandfather before him. But Coyote Ridge had been changing, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum like stones rolling down a hillside. Eastern investors had been sniffing around, offering cash for land that had been in families for generations. Some folks had taken the money and moved to town or headed further west. Others, like Jed, held fast to what their fathers had built with blood and sweat. Among those who held fast was Samuel Hutchins, owner of the sprawling Double H Ranch that bordered Jed's property to the south. Hutchins had arrived in Coyote Ridge 12 years ago with money already in his pocket and plans that reached beyond simple cattle ranching. He'd married Margaret Carlisle, daughter of the town's former mayor, and quickly established himself as a pillar of the community. His ranch house was a 2-story affair with imported furniture and a carriage that gleamed with fresh paint every Sunday. Morning, Hutchins carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. His hair was always perfectly groomed, his suits pressed, and his smile calculated to achieve maximum effect. He spoke of progress and prosperity, of bringing Coyote Ridge into the modern age. Some folks admired his vision. Others whispered that he moved too fast and cared too little for the old ways that had built this community. The tension between the old guard and the new had been simmering for months, coming to a head over water rights, grazing boundaries, and the unspoken question of who really belonged in Coyote Ridge. It was into this delicate balance that trouble had come walking, wearing the face of accusations and legal papers. 3 days ago, Sheriff Tom Bradley had knocked on Jed's door with news that would shake the foundation of everything the old rancher held dear. Someone had filed charges of fence cutting and cattle rustling against him, backed by what appeared to be solid evidence and the testimony of witnesses who swore they'd seen Jed's handiwork. In the dead of night, The accusations cut deep because they struck at the very heart of what Jed Toller stood for. In 37 years of ranching, he'd never taken so much as a stray calf that wasn't rightfully his. He'd built his reputation on fairness and integrity, qualities that seemed to matter less and less in a world that valued profit over principle. Now, as he sat in his kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, Jed stared at the legal papers spread across his oak table like autumn leaves. The words blurred together: criminal charges, evidence of fence cutting, altered brands, witness testimony. If convicted, he faced not just fines and jail time, but the loss of his ranch, the land that held every memory of his life with Sarah. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very fence line in question bordered Hutchins' property. The same fence line where Jed had found obvious signs of tampering just weeks before. Fresh cuts that had been hastily repaired, strange boot prints in the soft earth, and the unsettling feeling that someone had been watching his movements from the shadows. But who would believe an old rancher's word against evidence that seemed so convincing? Who would stand up for a man whose only crime was refusing to sell his land to developers who saw dollar signs where he saw home? The answer to that question lived 8 miles up in the mountains, in a cabin so remote that most folks forgot it existed. Eli Boone had been Jed's friend for more than 20 years, ever since the mountain man had helped him track down rustlers who'd made off with a dozen head of cattle. They'd formed an unlikely partnership, the civilized rancher and the wild hermit who read the land like other men read newspapers. Eli kept to himself most of the time, coming down to town only when supplies ran low or when Jed needed help with something that required more than 2 hands. He was a man carved from the mountain itself, with a beard that hadn't seen scissors in years and eyes that missed nothing. Folks in town viewed him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, never quite sure what to make of someone who chose solitude over society. But Jed knew the truth about Eli Boone. Beneath the wild exterior lived a man of unwavering loyalty and uncommon wisdom. Eli saw things others missed, heard sounds that escaped civilized ears, and understood the subtle language of tracks and signs that told stories more honest than any words. As the sun climbed higher and the morning shadows shortened, Jed made his decision. Tomorrow would bring the trial that could end everything he'd worked for, but he wouldn't face it alone. If Eli was willing to come down from his mountain sanctuary, maybe, just maybe, the truth would have a fighting chance against whatever forces had conspired to destroy an honest man's life. The coffee cup sat empty as Jed reached for his hat and walked toward the barn where his horse waited. Some things were worth fighting for, and some friendships ran deeper than the fear of losing everything. It was time to climb the mountain and ask for help from the one man who might have seen what really happened in the darkness along that disputed fence line. The dust from Jed's horse had barely settled when a figure emerged from the tree line near the creek. Samuel Hutchins sat astride his black gelding, watching the old rancher disappear into the foothills. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth as he turned his horse toward home, confident that tomorrow would bring the resolution he'd been working toward for months. After all, who would believe the word of a mountain hermit against carefully prepared evidence and respectable witnesses? Some battles were won before they were ever fought, and Samuel Hutchins had never been a man to leave anything to chance. The trail up to Eli's cabin wound through stands of lodgepole pine and over granite outcroppings that seemed to guard the mountain's secrets. Jed's horse picked its way carefully along the familiar path, breathing hard in the thin air as they climbed toward the tree line. The sound of Willow Creek grew fainter with each turn, replaced by the whisper of wind through evergreen branches and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Eli's cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, its weathered logs blending so perfectly with the landscape that a man could ride past without seeing it if he didn't know where to look. Smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney, and a garden of wild herbs grew in careful rows along the south-facing wall. This was a place carved from wilderness by someone who understood that survival meant working with nature, Not against it. Jed found Eli exactly where he expected, sitting on the front porch in a chair he'd built from lodgepole pine, whittling a piece of aspen wood with movements so precise they seemed almost meditative. The mountain man looked up as horse and rider emerged from the trees, his blue eyes taking in everything about Jed's posture and expression before settling on the legal papers tucked into the rancher's saddlebags. "Figured you'd be coming up the mountain sooner or later," Eli said, setting down his whittling knife and gesturing toward a second chair. "Coffee's still warm if you want some." Jed dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post Eli had carved from a single piece of granite. The two men had shared enough silences over the years that words weren't always necessary, but today carried a weight that demanded conversation. "They're saying I cut fences and rustled cattle, Eli. 20 head from Hutchins' spread. Brands changed with a running iron." Jed's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with accusations that made no sense. "Trial's tomorrow morning, and the evidence they've got looks pretty convincing." Eli poured coffee from a battered pot into 2 tin cups, handing one to Jed, before settling back into his chair. The mountain man's silence stretched long enough that Jed began to wonder if his friend believed the charges. When Eli finally spoke, his voice carried the certainty of someone who'd seen too much to be fooled by appearances. "Been watching your back fence for the better part of 3 weeks, Eli said, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. Too convenient, too clean." He paused to sip his coffee, then continued. "Man learns to read sign up here, Jed. And the sign around that fence line tells a different story than what folks in town are hearing." Relief flooded through Jed like cool water after a long drought. If Eli had been watching, then maybe there was hope after all. The mountain man's ability to read tracks and interpret the subtle signs left by human passage was legendary among those who knew him. More than once, he'd helped the sheriff track down criminals who thought they'd covered their trails perfectly. "What did you see?" Jed asked, leaning forward in his chair. Eli set down his coffee cup and walked to the edge of the porch, pointing toward the valley below, where the afternoon sun highlighted the patchwork of ranches and farmland. "Night of the 17th, I was tracking that wounded elk that's been favoring its left front leg. Trail led me down toward your fence line around midnight." The mountain man's voice took on the cadence of someone recounting events that had been burned into memory with perfect clarity. "Saw 3 men working along that fence, cutting wire and driving cattle through the gap. One of them was carrying a running iron, red hot and ready for brand changing. Another had a lantern, keeping the light low but bright enough for their work." Jed felt his heart racing. "Could you see their faces?" "Clear as daylight under that full moon." Eli turned back toward his friend, and Jed saw something in the mountain man's expression that made his blood run cold. Samuel Hutchins was directing the whole operation. The other 2 men, I recognized them from town. Jake Morrison and that new fellow Pete Sanders, who's been working odd jobs around the county. The implications hit Jed like a physical blow. Morrison was known as a man who'd do anything for money, and Sanders had the kind of reputation that made decent folks cross the street to avoid him. But to think that Hutchins himself would orchestrate such an elaborate frame-up seemed almost beyond belief. "Why?" Jed asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Your land sits right in the middle of the development project he's been putting together for those Eastern investors," Eli said, returning to his chair. "I've heard talk in town about plans for a railroad spur and maybe even a copper mine up in the hills behind your property. Hard to build an empire when one stubborn rancher won't sell." Eli reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in leather. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a metal button, the kind used on expensive Eastern-made shirts. "Found this caught on the fence wire the next morning when I went back to check the scene. Hutchins was wearing a shirt with buttons just like this when I saw him in town last week, but the mountain man wasn't finished." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a fresh scar that ran from his wrist almost to his elbow, a burn mark that looked like it had been made by a branding iron. "When I got too close to their operation that night, Sanders spotted me in the shadows. Hutchins sent him and Morrison after me with that running iron still hot from their work. Got away, but not before Sanders managed to catch me with the business end of that iron. Eli's voice remained calm, but Jed could see the controlled anger in his friend's eyes. Reckon that scar matches the iron they used to change your cattle's brands. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. Hutchins had orchestrated the entire scheme, using his hired men to steal cattle, change the brands, and plant evidence that would implicate Jed. The running iron that had burned Eli's arm was the same one used to alter the brands. Proof that would demolish Hutchins' carefully constructed case. "Will you testify?" Jed asked, knowing that he was asking his friend to step into a world that Eli had deliberately avoided for years. Eli stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the valley where lights were beginning to twinkle in ranch house windows as evening approached. When he turned back, his expression held the resolve of a man who'd made his decision. "Been thinking about it ever since that night," he said. "Figured you'd eventually need someone to speak the truth. And truth's something I've never been shy about telling." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Besides, that burn on my arm's been itching something fierce. Might be time to show folks what really happened out there in the dark." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, two friends sat in comfortable silence, knowing that tomorrow would bring a confrontation that would determine not just Jed's fate, but the future of honest men everywhere who refused to be bullied by those with money and power. The mountain had given up its witness, and Eli Boone was ready to come down from his sanctuary to speak truth in a place where lies had been dressed up to look like justice. Some battles were worth fighting, especially when they stood between good men and those who would destroy them for profit. The ride back down the mountain took place in darkness, punctuated by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on rocky trail. Eli followed behind Jed on his own horse, a sturdy mountain-bred mare named Sage, who knew these paths better than most folks knew their own front yards. The moon provided enough light to navigate safely, casting silver shadows through the pine branches that danced and shifted with each gust of wind. Jed's mind raced with the implications of what Eli had revealed. Having a witness changed everything, but it also raised new complications. Eli Boone was known in Coyote Ridge, but not well understood. The townspeople viewed him as an eccentric hermit, someone whose word might be questioned simply because he lived outside the boundaries of civilized society. Against the respected and well-connected Samuel Hutchins, Eli's testimony would face an uphill battle. "You know, folks in town don't quite know what to make of you," Jed said as they reached the bottom of the trail where it joined the main road to his ranch. Eli's chuckle carried on the night air. "Reckon that might work in our favor. Man who keeps to himself tends to see things others miss. Can't be bought off or pressured if nobody knows where to find him most of the time." They reached Jed's ranch house as the clock in town was striking 11. Sarah's rose garden, now tended by memory and habit, perfumed the night air with the sweet scent of late-blooming flowers. The familiar creak of the porch steps under their boots reminded Jed of countless evenings when he and Sarah had sat in these same chairs, planning their future and sharing their dreams. Inside, Eli examined the legal papers by lamplight, while Jed prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and leftover stew. The mountain man's reading was deliberate and careful, his weathered finger following each line as he absorbed the formal language that threatened to destroy his friend's life. "They've done their homework," Eli said finally, setting the papers aside. "Witness statements that put you near the fence line on the night in question. Physical evidence in the form of wire cutters found in your barn. Even got testimony from Morrison claiming you approached him about altering brands." Jed nearly dropped the bowl he was carrying. "Morrison said what?" "According to this, Jake Morrison swears you asked him about changing cattle brands 3 weeks ago. Says you were worried about making ends meet and wondered if there was easy money to be made in the cattle business." Eli's voice carried disgust at the transparent lie. Man's got no shame. Lying under oath like that, the realization hit Jed like a physical blow. Not only had Hutchins orchestrated the frame-up, but he'd convinced Morrison to commit perjury to ensure the case would stick. The web of deception was more elaborate than either man had imagined, involving multiple witnesses willing to lie for money or intimidation. "What about the wire cutters?" Jed asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Found in your barn 2 days after the alleged crime. Sheriff Bradley's report says they discovered them during a routine search, tucked behind some old harness leather." Eli met his friend's eyes. "Question is, how did they get there? You keep that barn locked up tight, and you're the only one with a key?" Jed thought about it for a moment, then walked to the kitchen window that looked out over the barn and corral. "Pete Sanders helped me fix that loose board on the barn door about a month ago. I gave him a key so he could get tools while I was in town getting supplies. Never thought to ask for it back." The pieces of Hutchins' plan became clearer with each revelation. Sanders had planted the wire cutters after using the key Jed had given him in good faith. The frame-up had been months in the planning, with every detail carefully considered to ensure maximum damage to Jed's reputation and legal standing. Eli joined Jed at the window, both men staring out at the barn that had been violated by men who called themselves neighbors. They counted on you being too trusting, too honest to see what was coming. "Good men always have that weakness. They think other folks are basically decent. Maybe that makes me a fool," Jed said, his voice heavy with self-doubt. "Makes you a good man in a world that's got too few of them." Eli placed a weathered hand on his friend's shoulder. "But it also means we've got to be smarter than them from here on out. They're fighting dirty, so we need to be ready for anything." The two men spent the next hour going over the details of Eli's testimony, making sure every fact was straight and every timeline accurate. The mountain man's memory for detail was remarkable, honed by years of tracking animals and reading sign in country where a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death. "Judge Whitmore's a fair man," Jed said as they prepared for bed. "Known him for 15 years, and he's always been straight with folks. But he's also careful about evidence, and Hutchins has put together what looks like a solid case." Eli settled into Sarah's old rocking chair, declining Jed's offer of the spare bedroom. Mountain men were used to sleeping under the stars, and a comfortable porch suited him fine. Fair judges look at all the evidence, not just what one side wants them to see. "Tomorrow, we'll give him something to think about." As Jed lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about the irony of his situation. For 37 years, he'd lived by a simple code: work hard, treat people fairly, and trust in the basic goodness of human nature. Now that philosophy had made him vulnerable to men who saw his decency as weakness to be exploited. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of his ranch settling into night quiet, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in days: hope. Not just because Eli had witnessed the truth, but because he'd remembered what it meant to have a friend willing to fight beside him when everything seemed lost. Outside on the porch, Eli Boone sat in Sarah's rocking chair, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. He'd spent too many years in the mountains to be surprised by men who moved in the shadows, and tomorrow's trial was too important to leave anything to chance. The metal button wrapped in leather rested in his shirt pocket, and the scar on his arm throbbed with each heartbeat, reminders of a truth that no amount of money or influence could change. Some battles were fought in courtrooms with words and evidence, but Eli knew that this war had started the night Hutchins decided that honest men were obstacles to be removed. Tomorrow would determine whether justice still had a voice in Coyote Ridge, or whether money and power had finally silenced truth altogether. Dawn broke gray and overcast, with heavy clouds promising rain before the day was through. Jed woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, finding Eli already dressed and preparing breakfast with the efficiency of a man accustomed to taking care of himself. The mountain man had been up since before sunrise, walking the perimeter of the ranch and checking for any signs that they'd had unwelcome visitors during the night. "Sleep any?" Eli asked, not looking up from the cast-iron skillet where bacon sizzled and popped. Some. Jed poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, grateful for the familiar ritual of morning routine. Been thinking about what you said last night, about them fighting dirty. Eli nodded toward the kitchen table, where he'd laid out a worn leather journal filled with his careful handwriting. Wrote down everything I remember from that night, along with dates and times for the past month, when I observed suspicious activity around your property. Figured the judge might want to see details beyond just my spoken word. Jed picked up the journal and read through several pages, marveling at the precise observations recorded there. Eli had documented tire tracks near the fence line, unusual activity at odd hours, and even sketches of the men he'd seen trespassing on Jed's land. The level of detail was extraordinary, painting a picture of systematic surveillance and planning that went far beyond a simple cattle theft. This is remarkable work. Eli, but it also means you've been watching my back for weeks without saying anything. The mountain man turned bacon in the skillet with practiced movements. Man lives alone long enough, he develops instincts about when trouble's brewing. Something about Hutchins never sat right with me, the way he smiled too much and asked too many questions about your plans for the ranch. Started paying closer attention when I heard talk in town about development money and railroad surveys. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, both men understanding that the next few hours would determine the course of their lives. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of rain from the mountains. Weather in this country could change as quickly as a man's fortune, and today felt charged with the electricity of an approaching storm. At 8 o'clock, Sheriff Tom Bradley's wagon appeared on the road leading to the ranch house. The sheriff was a decent man, caught in an impossible situation, forced to arrest someone he'd known and respected for decades based on evidence that seemed overwhelming. His face showed the strain of a man who took no pleasure in his duty. "Morning, Jed." "Eli." Bradley tipped his hat as he climbed down from the wagon. "I expect you know why I'm here." Jed nodded, reaching for his hat and the clean shirt he'd laid out for court. "We'll be along directly, Tom. No need for handcuffs or any of that business." "Wouldn't dream of it." The sheriff's relief was evident. "Judge Whitmore wants to start promptly at 9. Prosecutor Hayes drove down from the county seat yesterday, and he's got quite a presentation prepared." Eli emerged from the house carrying his leather journal and a small cloth bundle. The mountain man had cleaned up as much as his nature allowed, beard trimmed, hair pulled back, and wearing what passed for his best clothes. He still looked like someone more comfortable in the wilderness than a courtroom, but there was a dignity about him that spoke to his fundamental character. The ride to town took 20 minutes, during which Sheriff Bradley filled them in on the morning's developments. Samuel Hutchins had been at the courthouse since dawn, conferring with Prosecutor Hayes and reviewing witness statements. Margaret Hutchins had arrived wearing her finest dress, clearly intending to make an impression on the townsfolk who would be watching the proceedings. "Jake Morrison's already in town?" "Staying at Murphy's boarding house," Bradley said. "Pete Sanders drove in this morning with a wagon full of supplies, acting like he's planning to stay for a while." Jed felt his stomach tighten at the mention of the men who'd participated in framing him. The thought of facing them in court, knowing they would lie under oath to destroy him, made his hands clench into fists. Only Eli's steady presence beside him kept his anger from boiling over into something destructive. "What about Judge Whitmore?" Eli asked. "You been talking to anyone about the case?" "Judge keeps his own counsel," Bradley replied. "But I know he's troubled by the whole situation. Never seen him look so serious about a case, especially one involving someone with Jed's reputation." As they entered the outskirts of Coyote Ridge, they could see people gathering near the courthouse. More folks than usually showed up for anything short of a town celebration. Word of the trial had spread throughout the county, drawing curious spectators and genuine supporters of both sides. Some came to see justice done. Others simply wanted to witness the downfall of a man they'd respected for decades. The courthouse sat at the center of town like a weathered monument to order and civilization. Built of local stone with tall windows and a bell tower that chimed the hours, It represented the community's commitment to settling disputes through law rather than violence. Today, that commitment would be tested by men who viewed justice as just another commodity to be bought and sold. Eli helped Jed down from the wagon, both men straightening their shoulders as they faced the crowd gathering on the courthouse steps. Among the familiar faces of neighbors and friends, they could see the calculating expressions of those who'd already made up their minds about guilt or innocence, based on gossip and speculation. "Whatever happens in there," Eli said quietly, "remember that truth has a way of making itself known. Lies require constant maintenance, but truth just needs someone brave enough to speak it." Jed nodded, drawing strength from his friend's calm confidence. Together, they walked up the courthouse steps, past the whispered conversations and curious stares, toward a confrontation that would determine whether honest men could still find justice in a world increasingly dominated by money and influence. Behind them, Samuel Hutchins emerged from a carriage with his wife and prosecutor Hayes, the three of them projecting the confident bearing of people certain of victory. But Eli Boone carried something they couldn't buy or manufacture: the unshakable conviction of a man who'd witnessed truth firsthand and was prepared to defend it against any lie they could construct. The courthouse interior smelled of old wood, leather-bound law books, and the lingering traces of countless legal battles fought within its walls. Judge Harold Whitmore's courtroom was a study in frontier practicality, wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use, tall windows that let in the grey morning light, and an American flag that hung with dignified stillness beside the judge's bench. Judge Whitmore himself was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. At 68, he'd presided over this court for nearly 30 years, seeing everything from claim disputes to murder trials. His silver hair was always perfectly combed, his black robes pressed and dignified, and his manner suggested someone who took the weight of justice seriously. Those who knew him best said he'd rather dismiss a case than see an innocent man convicted. The gallery filled quickly as word spread that the trial was beginning. Ranchers, shopkeepers, and townspeople found seats on the hard wooden benches, their conversations creating a low murmur that echoed off the high ceiling. In the front row, Margaret Hutchins sat with practiced composure, her elaborate hat and expensive dress marking her as someone of importance. Behind her, Samuel Hutchins conferred quietly with Prosecutor Hayes, occasionally glancing toward the defendants, table where Jed sat with his court-appointed. Attorney Thomas Mitchell was a competent lawyer in his 50s who'd handled most of the legal work in Coyote Ridge for the better part of 2 decades. He was thorough, honest, and well-respected, but he specialized in property disputes and contract negotiations rather than criminal defense. The complexity of this case, with its web of evidence and witness testimony, clearly had him concerned. "The prosecution's case is strong on paper," Mitchell whispered to Jed as they reviewed their notes one final time. "But something about it feels too convenient, too perfect. Good criminal cases usually have loose ends and inconsistencies. This one's wrapped up like a Christmas present." Eli sat in the first row of the gallery, directly behind the defendant's table. The mountain man's presence drew curious stares from townsfolk who rarely saw him outside of Murphy's general store during his infrequent supply runs. His weathered hands rested calmly on his knees, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. Every expression, every gesture, every whispered conversation that might reveal something about the forces arrayed against his friend. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Whitmore entered through the door behind his bench, his black robes rustling as he took his seat. The bailiff called for order, and the courtroom fell silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm. "This court is now in session," Judge Whitmore announced, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench. "We are here today to hear the case of the Territory versus Jedediah Toller, charged with fence cutting and cattle rustling. Prosecutor Hayes, you may proceed with your opening statement," Benjamin Hayes rose from his chair with the confidence of a man who'd traveled the circuit courts for 15 years, winning cases through preparation and presentation rather than legal brilliance. He was younger than most expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of smooth manner that worked well with juries, but sometimes rubbed judges the wrong way. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "The evidence we will present today tells a clear and disturbing story. A story of a respected member of our community who allowed financial pressures and personal pride to corrupt his judgment." Hayes walked to the center of the courtroom, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture calculated to project sincerity and gravity. "We will show that on the night of September 17th, the defendant deliberately cut fences belonging to his neighbor, Samuel Hutchins, and stole 20 head of prime cattle. Furthermore, we will demonstrate that Mr. Toller used a running iron to alter the brands on these stolen animals, attempting to hide his crime through deception." Jed felt his face burning with shame and anger, not at the accusations themselves, but at hearing his name associated with crimes that violated everything he'd built his life upon. Beside him, Attorney Mitchell took careful notes, preparing to counter each point in his own opening statement. "The evidence is overwhelming," Hayes continued, now addressing Judge Whitmore directly. "We have witness testimony placing the defendant at the scene of the crime. We have physical evidence in the form of wire cutters found hidden in his barn. We have expert analysis of the altered brands that points directly to Mr. Toller's involvement." The prosecutor paused dramatically, letting his words settle over the courtroom like dust after a cattle drive. "But perhaps most damning of all, we have testimony from a reliable witness who will tell this court that the defendant approached him about the illegal alteration of cattle brands just weeks before this crime occurred." A murmur ran through the gallery at this revelation. Even those who'd supported Jed felt the weight of evidence mounting against him. Hayes had painted a picture of premeditation and careful planning that made the crime seem inevitable rather than impulsive. "Your Honor," Hayes concluded, "by the end of this trial, the evidence will show beyond any reasonable doubt that Jedediah Toller is guilty of the charges against him. Justice demands that he be held accountable for his actions, regardless of his previous reputation in this community." Hayes returned to his seat with the satisfied air of a man who delivered exactly the opening he'd planned. In the gallery, Samuel Hutchins nodded approvingly, while his wife maintained her composed expression. Several townspeople shifted uncomfortably in their seats, already beginning to reconsider their opinions about Jed's innocence. Attorney Mitchell rose to present the defense opening, but his task had been made significantly more difficult by Hayes's effective presentation. The room felt heavy with the weight of accusations that seemed supported by substantial evidence. "Your Honor," Mitchell began, his voice steady but lacking the prosecutor's dramatic flair, "my client stands before this court as he has lived his entire adult life, with integrity, honesty, and respect for his neighbors and the law. The prosecution would have you believe that a man who has spent 37 years building a reputation for fairness suddenly abandoned everything he believed, in for 20 head of cattle." Mitchell walked toward the jury box. "Though today, Judge Whitmore would be deciding the case himself. We will show that the evidence against Mr. Toller has been carefully manufactured by individuals who stand to benefit from his destruction. We will demonstrate that the real criminals in this case are the very people who point fingers at an innocent man." The attorney's words carried conviction, but even Jed could see that they lacked the specific details that had made Hayes' opening so compelling. Without Eli's testimony, the defense had little more than character references and general denials to offer against what appeared to be solid evidence. The prosecution's first witness was Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man caught between his duty to present evidence and his personal knowledge of Jed's character. Bradley took the witness stand with visible reluctance, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he swore to tell the truth. His testimony would establish the timeline and physical evidence that formed the foundation of the case against Jed. Sheriff Bradley, Prosecutor Hayes began. Please tell the court about your investigation into the theft of cattle from the Hutchins Ranch. Bradley cleared his throat and spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to giving testimony. On the morning of September 18th, Mr. Samuel Hutchins reported that 20 head of cattle had been stolen from his south pasture. Upon investigation, I found clear evidence of fence cutting along the boundary between the Hutchins and Toller properties. Hayes nodded encouragingly. What specific evidence did you discover at the scene? Fresh cuts in the wire fence made with professional tools. Boot prints in the soft earth near the fence line. Tracks indicating that cattle had been driven through the gap and across onto Toller property. Bradley's voice remained factual, but his discomfort was evident to anyone who knew him well. The prosecutor walked to his table and retrieved a leather case containing several metal tools. Sheriff, do you recognize these wire cutters? Bradley examined the tools carefully before answering. Yes, sir. These are the wire cutters I found hidden in Jedediah Toller's barn during a search conducted 2 days after the reported theft. A murmur ran through the courtroom at this revelation. Even Jed's supporters felt the weight of physical evidence that seemed to tie him directly to the crime. Hayes allowed the moment to settle before continuing his questioning. Were these cutters hidden in an obvious location? No, sir. They were wrapped in oilcloth and tucked behind some old harness leather in the back corner of the barn. Took us considerable searching to find them. Bradley's testimony was damaging, but his tone suggested he took no pleasure in presenting evidence against a man he'd respected for years. Attorney Mitchell rose for cross-examination, knowing he had to challenge the evidence without attacking the sheriff's credibility. Sheriff Bradley, in your 20 years of law enforcement, have you ever known Jedediah Toller to commit any crime, however minor? No, sir. Mr. Toller has always been a law-abiding citizen with an excellent reputation in this community. In fact, Mitchell continued, hasn't Mr. Toller assisted your office on several occasions when tracking rustlers and other criminals? Yes, sir. He's been helpful more times than I can count. Bradley's answer carried the weight of genuine respect, providing some balance to the damaging physical evidence. Mitchell walked toward the witness stand. His next question calculated to plant doubt about the investigation. Sheriff, when you found those wire cutters in Mr. Toller's barn, did it strike you as odd that an experienced rancher would hide evidence in such an obvious location? Hayes objected before Bradley could answer. Speculation, Your Honor. Sustained, Judge Whitmore ruled. But the question had served its purpose, reminding everyone that the evidence seemed almost too convenient. The prosecution's second witness was Jake Morrison, a man whose reputation for honesty was questionable at best. Morrison took the stand with the swagger of someone who felt protected by the legal system, his eyes avoiding direct contact with Jed as he settled into the witness chair. Mr. Morrison, Hayes began, please tell the court about your conversation with the defendant regarding cattle brands. Morrison cleared his throat nervously before answering. About 3 weeks ago, Jed Toller approached me at Murphy's saloon. He seemed worried about money, said the ranch wasn't bringing in what it used to. Asked me if I knew anything about changing cattle brands to make quick cash. The words hit Jed like physical blows. Morrison was committing perjury with such casual confidence that it took Jed's breath away. In the gallery, Eli Boone's hands tightened into fists as he watched a man destroy his friend's reputation with deliberate lies. How did you respond to this request? Hayes continued. Told him I didn't know nothing about that kind of business. Said it was illegal, and he should think twice before getting involved in anything like that. Morrison's performance was convincing to those who didn't know his character. Delivered with just the right mixture of reluctance and civic duty, Hayes nodded sympathetically. Was anyone else present during this conversation? Pete Sanders was sitting at the next table. He heard the whole thing. Attorney Mitchell's cross-examination of Morrison was more aggressive, reflecting the defense attorney's growing understanding that they were fighting a coordinated effort to destroy his client. Mr. Morrison. Isn't it true that you've been arrested 3 times in the past 5 years for various misdemeanors? Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Maybe once or twice for minor things. Isn't it also true that you've been looking for steady work since losing your last job at the Henderson Ranch for stealing grain? That was never proved, Morrison replied defensively. Mitchell walked closer to the witness stand, his voice taking on a harder edge. Mr. Morrison, have you been promised anything in exchange for your testimony today? Hayes jumped to his feet. Objection! The prosecutor is badgering the witness. Your Honor, Mitchell responded calmly. I'm simply trying to establish whether this witness has any motivation to lie. I'll allow the question, Judge Whitmore ruled. Please answer, Mr. Morrison. Morrison's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Eli caught it from his seat in the gallery. No, sir. Nobody promised me nothing. The lie was obvious to anyone watching Morrison's body language, but proving it would require evidence that Mitchell didn't have. The defense attorney returned to his table knowing that Morrison's testimony, however false, had done significant damage to their case as the morning wore on. The prosecution called Pete Sanders to corroborate Morrison's account of the saloon conversation. Sanders's testimony was smooth and confident, delivered with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with deception. He painted a picture of Jed as a desperate man willing to break the law to save his failing ranch. By the time Judge Whitmore called for a lunch recess, the prosecution had built what seemed like an overwhelming case against Jed. The physical evidence was damning. The witness testimony appeared credible to those who didn't know the witness's true character, and the motive was clearly established. During the break, Attorney Mitchell huddled with Jed and Eli behind the courthouse, their conversation urgent and worried. They've constructed this case very carefully, Mitchell said, his usual confidence shaken. Every piece of evidence supports their narrative, and the witnesses are backing each other up perfectly. Eli's weathered face remained calm despite the morning's devastating testimony. Perfect cases usually have perfect lies holding them together. Time to show the judge what really happened that night. The afternoon session would determine whether truth could overcome a carefully constructed web of deception, or whether Samuel Hutchins' money and influence had succeeded in destroying an honest man's life. The afternoon session began with a tension that seemed to press down on the courtroom, like the heavy clouds gathering outside. Thunder rolled across the mountains as Judge Whitmore called the court back to order, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the tall windows. The prosecution had rested their case, confident that they'd presented overwhelming evidence of Jed's guilt. Attorney Mitchell rose to call his first witness, knowing that everything depended on the next few minutes. Your Honor, the defense calls Eli Boone to the stand. A murmur ran through the gallery as the mountain man stood and walked toward the witness stand. Many of the spectators had never seen Eli up close, and his presence commanded attention in a way that surprised even those who'd known him for years. There was something about his bearing, a quiet dignity that spoke of a man comfortable with himself and unafraid of the truth, that made people lean forward in their seats. Eli placed his weathered hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth in a voice that carried the authority of the mountains themselves. As he settled into the witness chair, his eyes briefly met Jed's, conveying a reassurance that steadied his friend's nerves. Mr. Boone, Mitchell began, please tell the court where you live and how long you've known the defendant. I live up on Eagle Ridge, about 8 miles from town. Known Jed Toller for better than 20 years, ever since I helped him track down some rustlers who made off with his cattle. Eli's voice was calm and measured, each word carrying the weight of absolute honesty. In those 20 years, have you ever known Mr. Toller to engage in any illegal activity? No, sir. Jed Toller's the most honest man I've ever known. He'd go hungry before he'd take something that wasn't his. Mitchell nodded, then moved to the crucial question. Mr. Boone, were you anywhere near the boundary fence between the Toller and Hutchins properties on the night of September 17th? Eli straightened in his chair, his blue eyes taking on the intensity of a man about to speak truth in the face of elaborate lies. Yes, sir. I was tracking a wounded elk that had been favoring its left front leg. Trail led me down toward that fence line around midnight. The courtroom fell silent, except for the increasing sound of rain against the windows. Even Prosecutor Hayes seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. What did you observe at the fence line that night? Eli's testimony was precise and detailed, delivered with the authority of someone who'd spent decades reading sign and interpreting the subtle language of tracks and human behavior. I saw 3 men working along that fence, cutting wire and driving cattle through the gap. One of them was carrying a running iron, red-hot and ready for brand changing. Gasps echoed through the gallery at this revelation. In the front row, Samuel Hutchins shifted uncomfortably while his wife's composed expression began to crack around the edges. Were you able to identify any of these 3 men? Clear as daylight under that full moon, Eli replied, his voice gaining strength. Samuel Hutchins was directing the whole operation. The other 2 were Jake Morrison and Pete Sanders, the same men who testified against Jed this morning. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations and exclamations of shock. Judge Whitmore gavelled for order, but even his experienced composure seemed shaken by the magnitude of Eli's accusation. Prosecutor Hayes jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This witness is making serious accusations without any supporting evidence. Attorney Mitchell was ready for this challenge. Your Honor, if the court will allow Mr. Boone to continue his testimony, I believe he can provide substantial evidence to support his observations. Proceed, Mr. Boone, Judge Whitmore said, his voice reflecting both curiosity and judicial caution. Eli reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the leather-wrapped button he'd found at the fence line. Found this caught on the fence wire the next morning when I went back to examine the scene. It's from an expensive Eastern-made shirt, the kind Samuel Hutchins was wearing when I saw him in town the following week. Mitchell approached the witness stand to examine the button, then presented it to Judge Whitmore. The small piece of evidence seemed insignificant, but its implications were enormous. Is there anything else you observed that night, Mr. Boone? This was the moment that would either vindicate Jed or destroy Eli's credibility forever. The mountain man rolled up his sleeve, revealing the angry scar that ran from his wrist almost to his elbow. A burn mark that clearly came from a branding iron. When I got too close to their operation, Sanders spotted me in the shadows. Hutchins sent him and Morrison after me with that running iron still hot from changing cattle brands. Got away, but not before Sanders caught me with the business end of that iron. The scar was visible to everyone in the courtroom, a stark piece of physical evidence that corroborated Eli's testimony in a way that no amount of perjured statements could contradict. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Mr. Boone, Mitchell continued, are you certain that the men you saw were Samuel Hutchins, Jake Morrison, and Pete Sanders? Certain as I am that the sun rises in the east, Eli replied. I've been tracking men and animals for 30 years. Don't make mistakes about things like that. Prosecutor Hayes rose for cross-examination, but his confident demeanor had been replaced by the desperate air of a man watching his case collapse. Mr. Boone, isn't it convenient that you happened to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to witness this alleged crime? Eli's blue eyes fixed on the prosecutor with the steady gaze of someone untroubled by doubts about his own honesty. Nothing convenient about it. Been tracking that wounded elk for 3 days, following sign that any competent tracker could read. Wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble found me anyway. And this scar you claim came from a branding iron. Couldn't that have been caused by any number of accidents? Eli held up his arm, displaying the distinctive pattern of the burn. This scar matches exactly the business end of a running iron. Any cowman in this room can tell you that. Burns from other sources don't leave marks like this. Hayes continued his cross-examination for another 10 minutes, but each question seemed to strengthen rather than weaken Eli's testimony. The mountain man's answers were consistent, detailed, and delivered with unshakable conviction. As Eli stepped down from the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. What had begun as a straightforward case against Jetola had transformed into something far more complex and disturbing, a conspiracy involving respected members of the community and a frame-up orchestrated by the very man claiming to be the victim. Judge Whitmore called for a brief recess, during which urgent conversations filled the gallery. Samuel Hutchins huddled with his attorney, their voices low and intense. Margaret Hutchins sat frozen in her seat, her elaborate hat suddenly seeming like a costume worn by someone playing a role she no longer understood. In the back of the courtroom, Jake Morrison and Pete Sanders exchanged worried glances, clearly unprepared for their night's work to be exposed in such devastating detail. The web of lies they'd helped construct was unraveling, and both men looked like they wanted to be anywhere but in that courthouse. When court resumed, Attorney Mitchell called one additional witness, Dr. Henry Caldwell, the town's physician, and a man whose reputation for honesty was beyond question. Dr. Caldwell, Mitchell asked, "Have you examined the scar on Mr. Boone's arm?"
"Yes, I have."
During the recess, I examined the wound carefully. In my professional opinion, this scar was definitely caused by a hot branding iron applied with considerable force. The pattern and depth of the burn are consistent with the business end of a running iron used for altering cattle brands. With that expert testimony, the defense rested their case. The truth that Eli Boone had witnessed in the darkness had finally been brought into the light, transforming a seemingly hopeless situation into a moment of vindication for an innocent man. But even as the tide turned in Jed's favor, the implications of what had been revealed would send shockwaves through the entire community. Samuel Hutchins wasn't just guilty of cattle theft. He'd orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to destroy a neighbor's life and reputation. The respected businessman who'd spoken of progress and prosperity had revealed himself to be something far darker and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The revelation of Eli's testimony sent shockwaves through the courthouse that extended far beyond the immediate case. Judge Whitmore called for a 30-minute recess to allow all parties to consider the dramatic turn of events. But the break became a whirlwind of urgent conferences, whispered conversations, and the kind of tension that precedes a thunderstorm. Samuel Hutchins sat with his attorney in a corner of the courthouse lobby, their hushed conversation growing increasingly heated as the implications of Eli's testimony became clear. Hutchins's carefully constructed facade of respectability was crumbling, and with it, his plans for acquiring Jed's ranch and the broader development project that had motivated his elaborate conspiracy. "We need to challenge the mountain man's credibility," Hutchins hissed to his lawyer, his polished demeanor replaced by barely controlled desperation. "He's a hermit, an outsider. Who's going to believe his word against mine?" But even as he spoke the words, Hutchins knew they rang hollow. Eli's testimony had been too detailed, too consistent, and supported by physical evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. The button found at the fence line, the distinctive scar from the branding iron, and Dr. Caldwell's expert confirmation had created a web of corroboration that would be difficult to break. Margaret Hutchins stood nearby, her face pale beneath the elaborate hat that had seemed so appropriate for a respectable woman supporting her wronged husband. Now it felt like a costume from a play she no longer understood. For 12 years, she'd believed she'd married a man of vision and integrity. The discovery that her husband was capable of such calculated deception left her feeling hollow and betrayed. "Samuel," she whispered, approaching her husband with hesitant steps, "is what that mountain man said true? Did you really?" "Don't be ridiculous, Margaret," Hutchins snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's obviously a conspiracy between Tola and his wild friend to deflect attention from the real crime." But Margaret Hutchins wasn't a fool. She'd lived with Samuel long enough to recognize the signs when he was cornered, the way his voice took on a different quality and his eyes refused to meet hers directly. The terrible possibility that everything she'd believed about her life was built on lies began to settle over her like a suffocating blanket. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison and Pete Sanders huddled near the courthouse exit, their earlier confidence replaced by the panicked expressions of men who realized they'd been caught in an elaborate web that was now collapsing around them. Morrison's hands shook as he fumbled for his tobacco pouch, while Sanders kept glancing toward the door as if calculating his chances of escape. "That mountain man saw everything," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain that continued to pound against the courthouse windows. "He's got details nobody could make up. What are we going to do?" Sanders' face had taken on the grayish pallor of a man facing the gallows. Hutchins said this would be simple. Get rid of Tuller, split the money from selling his land to those Eastern investors. Nobody was supposed to be watching from the hills. The two men had been paid handsomely for their participation in framing Jed, but neither had considered the possibility that their night's work would be witnessed by someone with Eli Boone's reputation for honesty and attention to detail. Now they faced not just exposure, but potential criminal charges that could see them spending years in territorial prison. On the other side of the courthouse, Jed sat with Attorney Mitchell and Eli, the three men finally able to breathe freely for the first time since the ordeal began. The weight of false accusations that had pressed down on Jed for days was lifting, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude for the friend who'd risked everything to speak the truth. "I can't believe you were watching over me all those weeks without saying anything," Jed said to Eli. His voice thick with emotion, the mountain man's weathered face showed a slight smile. "Man looks after his friends, Jed, always have, always will. Besides, something about Hutchins never sat right with me. Too smooth, too eager to ask questions about your plans for the ranch." Attorney Mitchell reviewed his notes from Eli's testimony, marveling at the precision and detail of the mountain man's observations. "Your testimony was remarkable, Eli. The level of detail, the consistency of your account, and the physical evidence to back it up. It's exactly what we needed to expose this conspiracy." But even as they celebrated the turning tide, all three men understood that the case wasn't over. Judge Whitmore still had to render his verdict, and Samuel Hutchins wasn't the type of man to surrender without exhausting every possible avenue of escape. The final confrontation was yet to come, and Hutchins' desperation made him potentially dangerous in ways they couldn't fully predict. Dr. Caldwell approached their table, his medical bag in hand, and his expression troubled by what he'd witnessed. "Jed, I owe you an apology. I've known you for 15 years, and I should never have doubted your integrity, even when the evidence seemed overwhelming." "No apology needed, Doc," Jed replied. "Evidence can be manufactured, but truth has a way of surfacing when good people are willing to look for it." Sheriff Bradley appeared at Jed's shoulder, his own expression reflecting the complex emotions of a lawman who'd been forced to arrest an innocent man. "Jed, I'm going to need to ask you some questions about what you knew regarding Hutchins' activities. If what Eli testified to is true, we're looking at charges of conspiracy, perjury, and cattle theft against several people. The implications were staggering. Samuel Hutchins, one of the most respected men in Coyote Ridge, faced potential criminal charges that would destroy not just his business interests, but his entire standing in the community. Morrison and Sanders were looking at serious jail time for their participation in the conspiracy and their perjured testimony. As the recess stretched toward its conclusion, word of Eli's testimony began to spread throughout the town. People gathered in small groups outside the courthouse, their conversations animated by the shocking revelation that one of their leading citizens had orchestrated such an elaborate deception. The rain continued to fall, but it seemed to be washing away more than just dust from the streets. It was cleansing the community of illusions they'd held about respectability and progress. Inside the courthouse, Prosecutor Hayes found himself in an impossible position. The case he'd thought was ironclad had disintegrated before his eyes, replaced by evidence that the real criminals were his own witnesses. His professional integrity demanded that he acknowledge the truth, even though it meant admitting that he'd been used as a tool in Hutchins' conspiracy. "Your Honor," Hayes said as court reconvened. In light of the testimony presented by Mr. Boone and the corroborating evidence provided by Dr. Caldwell, the prosecution requests permission to withdraw all charges against Jedediah Toller, but Judge Whitmore wasn't satisfied with simply dismissing the charges against Jed. The revelation of such an elaborate conspiracy demanded a more thorough response from the legal system. Mr. Hayes, the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of judicial experience. While I appreciate your professional integrity in acknowledging the weakness of your case, this court cannot simply ignore the serious allegations that have been made against other parties. Judge Whitmore turned his attention to Samuel Hutchins, who sat rigid in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by the desperate stillness of a cornered animal. Mr. Hutchins, the testimony presented today suggests that you may have orchestrated a conspiracy involving cattle theft, perjury, and the deliberate frame-up of an innocent man. Do you wish to respond to these allegations? The moment of truth had arrived. Samuel Hutchins faced a choice between confessing his crimes and maintaining his innocence in the face of overwhelming evidence. His response would determine not just his own fate, but the final resolution of a case that had exposed the dark underbelly of ambition and greed lurking beneath Coyote Ridge's veneer of respectability. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for Hutchins to speak, understanding that his next words would either confirm his guilt or set the stage for an even more dramatic confrontation between truth and the lies that had nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. Samuel Hutchins rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate and controlled, despite the chaos swirling around him. For a moment, he stood in silence, his calculating eyes sweeping across the courtroom, as if measuring the faces of people who had once respected him. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows with a rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of hearts throughout the tense room. "Your Honor," Hutchins began, his voice carrying the same smooth confidence that had served him well in business dealings for more than a decade. "I find myself the victim of a coordinated attack on my character and reputation by men who would benefit greatly from my downfall." Judge Whitmore's expression remained impassive, but his eyes reflected the wariness of someone who had heard too many desperate men attempt to talk their way out of overwhelming evidence. "Mr. Hutchins, you stand accused of serious crimes. I suggest you choose your words carefully." Hutchins straightened his shoulders, drawing upon years of projecting authority and command in business negotiations. "The testimony of this mountain hermit is nothing more than the wild imaginings of a man who lives outside civilized society. Eli Boone has admitted to trespassing on my property, to watching my movements from the shadows like some sort of predator. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, acrid and transparent to anyone willing to examine it closely. Hutchins was attempting to turn Eli's vigilance into something sinister, to make the mountain man's protective watch over his friend seem like the behavior of a criminal. Furthermore, Hutchins continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his theme, this supposed evidence consists of nothing more than a common button that could have come from any shirt, and a scar that could have been caused by any number of accidents. Are we to convict respectable citizens based on the fevered accusations of a man who chooses to live like a wild animal? In the gallery, Eli Boone listened to these words with the calm stillness of someone accustomed to weathering storms. The mountain man's blue eyes never left Hutchins' face, reading the subtle signs of desperation beneath the polished exterior. Years of tracking dangerous animals had taught Eli to recognize when a cornered creature was preparing to make a final, desperate strike. Margaret Hutchins watched her husband's performance with growing horror, recognizing the calculated manipulation she'd seen him use in business dealings, but never imagined he would employ in a court of law. The man she'd married was revealing depths of deception that made her question everything about their 12 years together. The real criminals here, Hutchins declared, pointing dramatically toward Jed and Eli, "are the men who conspired to steal my cattle and then constructed this elaborate lie to deflect suspicion from themselves." Jedediah Toller was facing financial ruin, desperate enough to resort to theft to save his failing ranch. But even as Hutchins spoke, his carefully constructed defense began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. Judge Whitmore had been presiding over cases for 30 years, and he could read the difference between righteous indignation and desperate fabrication. "Mr. Hutchins," the judge interrupted, his voice cutting through the defendant's rhetoric like a sharp blade. "You speak of evidence as if it doesn't exist, but this court has heard testimony from a credible witness, seen physical evidence that corroborates his account, and received expert medical testimony confirming the nature of Mr. Boone's injuries." Hutchins' composure wavered for just a moment, a crack in the facade that revealed the panic beneath. "Your Honor, surely you don't intend to take the word of a mountain hermit over that of a respected businessman who has contributed significantly to this community's growth and prosperity." The appeal to class and social standing was Hutchins' final card, an attempt to leverage his position in the community against the testimony of a man who lived outside its boundaries. But Judge Whitmore had built his reputation on the principle that justice was blind to wealth and social status. "Mr. Hutchins," the judge said, his voice carrying the accumulated authority of 3 decades on the bench. "In this courtroom, the only thing that matters is truth. Wealth cannot purchase innocence, and social standing cannot erase criminal behavior." The words struck Hutchins like physical blows, each syllable dismantling the foundation of privilege and influence he'd assumed would protect him. For the first time since the trial began, his mask of confidence slipped completely, revealing the desperate face of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. In that moment of revelation, the true scope of Hutchins' arrogance became clear to everyone in the courtroom. He had believed that his money and position would allow him to destroy an innocent man without consequence, that the legal system existed to serve those with power rather than to protect the innocent. But justice, like truth, had a way of asserting itself when good people were willing to stand up and speak. The mountain man's testimony had stripped away Hutchins' pretenses, leaving him exposed as what he truly was, a criminal who had nearly succeeded in destroying a good man's life for his own profit. The breaking point came when Jake Morrison could no longer bear the weight of watching Samuel Hutchins attempt to destroy Eli Boone's credibility. The grizzled ranch hand had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, his face growing paler with each word of Hutchins' defense. Finally, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that echoed through the tense silence. "I can't listen to any more of this," Morrison declared, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and unexpected courage. "Everything that mountain man said is true. Every word of it." The courtroom erupted in gasps and urgent whispers as Morrison made his way toward the front of the room, his steps unsteady but determined. Judge Whitmore gavelled for order, but his own surprise was evident in the slight widening of his eyes. "Your Honor," Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, "I was there that night. Samuel Hutchins paid me and Pete Sanders $500 each to help him steal those cattle and frame Jed Toller. We cut that fence, drove those cattle across, and used that running iron to change the brands, just like Eli Boone said." Samuel Hutchins' face went ashen as his carefully constructed defense collapsed completely. The man who had moments before been proclaiming his innocence now found himself betrayed by one of his own conspirators. "Jake," Hutchins said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you don't know what you're saying. The strain of these proceedings has obviously—" "I know exactly what I'm saying," Morrison interrupted, turning to face the man who had dragged him into this conspiracy. "You told us it would be simple. Get rid of Toller, sell his land to those Eastern investors, and everybody makes money. But you never said anything about burning innocent men or destroying lives." Morrison rolled up his own sleeve, revealing a smaller but unmistakable burn mark on his forearm. "When that mountain man got too close, you ordered Sanders to go after him with that hot iron. I tried to stop it, but Sanders was already swinging. That's when I knew we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed." The revelation of Morrison's own burn, evidence that he'd been present during the attack on Eli, provided final confirmation of the mountain man's testimony. Even Pete Sanders, who had been sitting frozen in his seat, seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon as his last hope of escape evaporated. Judge Whitmore looked directly at Samuel Hutchins, his expression reflecting 3 decades of judicial experience in reading the guilt written across human faces. "Mr. Hutchins, in light of this confession by your accomplice, do you wish to maintain your plea of innocence?" For a long moment, Hutchins stood silent, his mind racing through options that no longer existed. The elaborate conspiracy that had taken months to plan had unraveled in a matter of hours, undone by the integrity of a mountain man and the unexpected conscience of a paid accomplice. Margaret Hutchins rose from her seat in the front row, her elegant dress and expensive hat now seeming like costumes from a play that had ended badly. She looked at her husband with eyes that held no trace of the respect and affection that had sustained their marriage for 12 years. "Samuel," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "for once in your life, tell the truth." The words from his own wife struck Hutchins like a physical blow, stripping away the last vestiges of his dignity and authority. In that moment he understood that he had lost everything: his business, his reputation, his marriage, and his freedom. "Your Honor," Hutchins said finally, his voice hollow and defeated. He paused, struggling with words that would seal his fate. "I cannot continue to maintain my innocence in the face of such testimony." It wasn't quite a confession, but it was an acknowledgement that carried the weight of admission. Judge Whitmore nodded gravely, understanding that pride sometimes prevented men from speaking the complete truth, even when their guilt was beyond question. "Mr. Hutchins," the judge said, "this court finds the evidence against you overwhelming and credible. You stand accused of conspiracy, cattle theft, perjury, and assault. Sheriff Bradley, please take Mr. Hutchins into custody." As the sheriff approached with handcuffs, Samuel Hutchins looked once more around the courtroom that had witnessed his downfall. His eyes briefly met those of Jed Toller, the man he had tried to destroy. But he found no satisfaction there, only the quiet dignity of someone who had endured injustice without allowing it to corrupt his soul. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the courthouse like the closing of a book, marking the end of a chapter in Coyote Ridge's history and the beginning of justice for an innocent man who had nearly lost everything to another man's greed. In the gallery, Eli Boone sat quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap, watching as truth finally triumphed over the elaborate lies that had threatened to destroy his friend's life. 3 months later, autumn had painted the mountains surrounding Coyote Ridge in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The aspens quivered in the crisp morning air, their leaves catching the sunlight like scattered coins as Jed Toller sat on his front porch, watching the sun rise over land that remained his own. The familiar creak of Sarah's old rocking chair had become a comforting rhythm in his daily routine, a reminder that some things endured despite the storms that occasionally swept through a man's life. The legal proceedings had concluded, with Samuel Hutchins sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for conspiracy and cattle theft. Jake Morrison received 2 years for his participation, but had his sentence reduced due to his cooperation with the court. Pete Sanders, who had refused to confess even in the face of overwhelming evidence, received the full penalty of 4 years. The Eastern Development Project had collapsed with Hutchins' conviction, leaving Coyote Ridge to continue its quieter evolution without the disruption of forced progress. Margaret Hutchins had sold her husband's ranch and business interests, using the proceeds to pay restitution to Jed and to establish a small fund for legal aid in cases involving disputed land rights. She had moved back east to live with her sister, carrying with her the hard-won wisdom that respectability could mask the darkest intentions. And that true character revealed itself not in prosperity, but in how one treated those with less power. Sheriff Tom Bradley stopped by the ranch most mornings now, sharing coffee and conversation with a man he'd been forced to arrest but had never stopped respecting. The weight of that experience had changed Bradley, making him more careful about accepting evidence at face value and more attentive to the quiet voices that sometimes carried the most truth. Eli still up in his cabin? Bradley asked, settling into the chair that had become his regular spot during these morning visits. Where else would he be? Jed replied with a smile. Though he comes down more often now. Seems like speaking the truth in that courtroom reminded him that civilization isn't entirely hopeless. The mountain man had indeed become a more frequent visitor to town. His dramatic testimony having earned him a level of respect that transcended the usual suspicion reserved for those who lived outside society's boundaries. Children pointed at him with awe when he rode down Main Street, and adults nodded with genuine gratitude to the man who had saved one of their own from injustice. Dr. Caldwell had examined Eli's scar several more times, documenting it thoroughly for medical journals as an example of how physical evidence could corroborate witness testimony in legal proceedings. The case had attracted attention from legal scholars throughout the territory, becoming a landmark example of how careful investigation could uncover elaborate conspiracies. "Town's been quieter since all the excitement," Bradley observed, sipping his coffee and watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily overhead. "Quiet suits me fine," Jed replied. "Though I have to admit, there's something to be said for knowing who your real friends are. Amazing how many people suddenly remembered they'd always believed in my innocence once the truth came out." The two men sat in comfortable silence, both understanding that some experiences changed a person's perspective on human nature forever. Jed had learned that trust, while valuable, needed to be tempered with wisdom. Bradley had discovered that the badge he wore carried responsibilities that extended beyond simply enforcing existing laws to protecting the innocent from those who would manipulate the system for personal gain. Around 10 o'clock, a familiar figure emerged from the trail leading down from Eagle Ridge. Eli Boone rode his sure-footed mare with the easy grace of someone who belonged in wild country, a leather satchel slung across his shoulder and the contented expression of a man at peace with his place in the world. "Morning, gentlemen," Eli called as he approached the porch. "Brought something I thought you might want to see." The mountain man dismounted and reached into his satchel, withdrawing a carefully wrapped object that he handed to Jed with ceremonial gravity. Inside the cloth wrapping was the running iron that had been used to alter the cattle brands, evidence that had been returned to him after the trial concluded. "Figured it was time this got disposed of properly," Eli said. "Some tools are made for honest work, but this one was only used for deception." Together, the three men walked to Jed's forge, where the iron was heated until it glowed red-hot. Then, using hammers and tongs, they methodically destroyed the tool that had caused so much trouble, each blow striking not just metal, but the memory of injustice overcome through courage and friendship. As they worked, Jed reflected on the profound changes that had occurred since that grey morning, when accusations first threatened to destroy everything he'd built. The experience had tested his faith in human nature, but it had also revealed the power of loyalty and truth when good men were willing to stand together against deception. "You know," Jed said as they watched the destroyed iron cool in the evening air, "I learned something important through all this. It's not enough to live honestly yourself. Sometimes you have to be willing to fight for honesty when others try to destroy it." Eli nodded, his weathered face reflecting the wisdom earned through decades of observing both human and animal nature. "Truth's like water, Jed. You can dam it up for a while, divert its course, even pollute it temporarily. But eventually, it finds its way through every obstacle and runs clean again." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that rivaled the autumn foliage, The three men stood together in comfortable fellowship. They had faced a test that revealed the best and worst of human nature, and they had emerged with their integrity intact and their friendship strengthened. The mountain had given up its witness when justice needed a voice, proving that sometimes the most unlikely heroes stand up when everyone else sits down. In Coyote Ridge, the story of Eli Boone's courage would be told for generations, a reminder that truth spoken with conviction could overcome even the most elaborate deceptions crafted by those who mistake power for righteousness.